You're watching Southern Crimes.
June 23rd, 1965, a sweltering Houston afternoon. Two police officers approach a modest yellow brick home in the Montrose neighborhood, expecting nothing more than a routine welfare check. The elderly couple living there hasn't been heard from in days. After finding no answer at the door, the officers make their way around back. Something feels wrong. Flower pots are stacked against the rear entrance, forming an unusual barricade. They force their way inside. The house is quiet, too quiet. In the dining room, food sits untouched on the table, as if someone had been interrupted mid-meal. Officer Charles Bullock makes his way to the kitchen and, for reasons he would later struggle to explain, opens the refrigerator door. What he discovers inside will haunt him for decades. Neatly stacked on the shelves are what appear to be cuts of meat, washed and carefully arranged. But as Bullock begins to close the door, his eyes catch something in the vegetable drawer below, a human head, and beside it, another. The heads belong to Fred and Edwina Rogers, both in their 70s. The meat on the shelves, their dismembered remains. But the most disturbing question wasn't what had happened in this house of horrors. It was who had done it, and where was their reclusive son, Charles Rogers, who'd lived with them for years, yet was barely known to exist by neighbors. This is Southern Crimes. Fred Rogers was born in 1884, coming of age in the aftermath of America's Gilded Age. By all outward appearances, he was a respectable real estate salesman in Houston, but beneath this veneer of respectability lay a much more complex truth. Those who knew Fred described him as manipulative and controlling. He reportedly worked as a bookie on the side, engaging in illegal gambling operations and various insurance fraud schemes. His wife, Edwina, born in 1892, maintained the appearance of a proper Houston housewife, but was said to be equally cunning when it came to financial matters. Together, they created a household that appeared normal from the outside, but harbored deep dysfunction within, a place where family members existed alongside one another rather than truly connecting. As they aged into their 70s and 80s, Fred could often be seen collecting old newspapers from neighbors' trash cans, supposedly to sell for extra cash. Edwina, on the other hand, maintained a quiet presence, keeping mostly to herself, but remaining cordial with neighbors. Their lifestyle may have seemed odd, but nothing about them raised serious alarms. They were just another elderly couple living out their final years in quiet obscurity, or so it seemed. But there was a third resident at 1815 Driscoll Street, one whose presence remained largely unknown to the outside world. Charles Rogers was born in 1921, the only child of Fred and Edwina. From an early age, it was clear he was different, not in a bad way, but in his exceptional intelligence and withdrawn nature. While neighborhood children played outside, Charles remained in his room, reading and studying. He showed remarkable academic promise, eventually pursuing higher education at a time when many Americans didn't even finish high school. After briefly attending Texas A&M University, Charles transferred to the University of Houston, where he earned a degree in nuclear physics. When World War II erupted, he answered the call to serve, becoming a pilot in the United States Navy and serving in the Office of Naval Intelligence. This combination of technical knowledge, intelligence work, and aviation skills would shape Rogers' future in ways no one could have anticipated. After the war, Charles landed a position that seemed perfect for his skills and education. He became a seismologist for Shell Oil, a job he would hold for 9 years. Colleagues described him as having an uncanny talent for finding oil, gas, and gold deposits. But in 1957, at age 36, Charles did something that puzzled everyone who knew him. Without any explanation or warning, he simply walked away from his successful career. By the early 1960s, Charles had become something of a ghost in his own life. Though living with his elderly parents, he developed such reclusive habits that he specifically left home before dawn each day and only returned after dark. He communicated with Fred and Edwina primarily through notes slipped under doors. Most neighbors thought the elderly couple lived alone. Charles had become so adept at avoiding human contact that he'd essentially become invisible in his own neighborhood. No one, not even his parents, seemed to know what Charles did during those long hours away from home. His cousin Marvin, one of the very few people who knew he existed, believed he might be working as an electrician, but couldn't say for certain. So here was a man with a degree in nuclear physics, deep military ties, and a successful career in the oil industry, now living like a phantom in his parents' house in his early 40s. This strange, silent coexistence would continue until Father's Day 1965, when something finally shattered the fragile equilibrium of the Rogers household. June 20, 1965, Father's Day. The summer heat in Houston was already becoming unbearable. This would be the last day that anyone would see Fred and Edwina Rogers alive. 3 days later, Edwina's nephew Marvin called the police. He'd been trying to reach his aunt by phone since Friday, but his calls had gone unanswered. He knew something wasn't right. His aunt was typically reliable about answering the phone. When officers Charles Bullock and L.M. Barta arrived at the Rogers home on June 23rd, they found the house eerily still. After discovering the barricaded back door and forcing their way inside, they began a careful search of the premises. Nothing seemed obviously wrong at first. The dining room table was set with food, as if someone was about to eat. Old newspapers were stacked throughout the house, dirty dishes piled in the sink, signs of life interrupted. Then came Officer Bullock's fateful decision to open the refrigerator. Later, he would say,
"I don't know why I looked in the refrigerator. For some reason, I just opened it."
What the officers found inside was beyond comprehension. The refrigerator was filled with neatly stacked, washed, unwrapped meat, human flesh that had been carefully butchered and arranged on the shelves. In the vegetable bins below were the heads of Fred and Edwina Rogers. The medical examiner would later determine that Fred had been beaten to death with a claw hammer. He'd also been severely mutilated. Edwina had been beaten and shot execution style in the head. The bodies had been dismembered in the upstairs bathroom by someone with some knowledge of anatomy. There was little blood in the house. It had been thoroughly cleaned after the murders. What little blood was found led to Charles's bedroom. There, police found a blood-stained keyhole saw, but no trace of Charles Rogers himself. A search for Rogers was launched immediately, and a warrant was issued for him as a material witness to the crime, but Charles had vanished without a trace. The investigation that followed would reveal disturbing details about the Rogers family dynamic. Despite his brilliant mind and impressive credentials, Charles had apparently been living in a state of constant tension with his parents. Hugh and Martha Gardenier, a Houston couple who would later investigate the case extensively, uncovered evidence suggesting that Fred and Edwina were far from innocent victims. According to their research, Fred had allegedly been abusive to Charles throughout his life, and both parents had been stealing money from their own son. They'd reportedly taken out loans in Charles's name and forged his signature on property deeds. The house they lived in actually belonged to Charles, but Edwina had been taking out loans against it, keeping the money. But Charles never stuck around to tell his side of the story. The meticulous nature of the crime scene suggested this was something he'd planned from start to finish. As police launched a nationwide manhunt, the search for Charles would lead investigators down various paths. Some believed he'd fled to Mexico, using his connections from the oil industry to establish a new life there. Others thought he might have used his pilot's license to fly himself to freedom. But with no trace of him ever being found, by 1975, 10 years after the murder, a Houston judge officially declared Charles Rogers legally dead. The case might remain open technically, but that's about as cold as it can get. In the decades following the murders, the case of Charles Rogers took on an almost mythical quality in Houston lore. The gruesome nature of the crime, combined with the mysterious disappearance of the prime suspect, created fertile ground for speculation and conspiracy theories. The most sensational of these theories emerged in 1992, when authors John R. Craig and Philip A. Rogers published a book called The Man on the Grassy Knoll. In it, they made an extraordinary claim. Charles Rogers wasn't just a murderer who disappeared. He was allegedly a CIA operative who'd been involved in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. According to this theory, Rogers had been one of the, quote, 3 tramps arrested in Dealey Plaza after Kennedy's assassination. The motive for killing his parents? They'd discovered his diary entries that proved his involvement in the conspiracy to assassinate the president. While these claims might seem far-fetched, certain aspects of Rogers' background made them intriguing. His military intelligence background, his scientific education, his ability to speak 7 languages, and his mysterious departure from Shell Oil all seemed to fit the profile of someone who might have been recruited for covert operations. But the Gardeniers, who'd spent years investigating the case, came to a much different conclusion. While they acknowledged that Rogers had connections to CIA contract workers through his work as a seismologist, they found no evidence that he was a CIA operative himself. Instead, they traced a different path for Rogers, saying he fled to Mexico after the murders, aided by powerful friends he'd made through his ham radio hobby and his work in the oil and mining industries. The Gardeniers traced him to Honduras, where they claim he met his end, killed over a wage dispute with miners. Like everything else in this case, these are just theories. The truth about what actually happened to Charles Rogers after June 23, 1965 remains as mysterious as the man himself. The house where the Icebox murders took place stood empty for years afterward. A horror like this isn't easily forgotten or overlooked. But in the end, it proved too much to overcome, and in 1972, it was finally torn down completely. The lot remained vacant until 2000, when condominiums were built on the site. But the mystery of Charles Rogers and the Icebox murders lives on. In an age well before cell phones, before GPS tracking, before the internet and social media, a highly educated man committed one of the most gruesome murders in Texas history, then disappeared without a trace. He managed to evade a nationwide manhunt despite having a unique background that should have made him easy to spot. Was Charles Rogers simply a brilliant man who snapped after years of abuse and financial exploitation by his parents? Or was he a covert operative whose parents discovered something they shouldn't have? Or was he something else entirely? We may never know the full truth about Charles Rogers or the Icebox murders. The case remains officially unsolved, with Rogers as the only suspect. Sometimes the most horrifying monsters aren't made of the things in horror movies. They're brilliant, educated people, slipping notes under doors and disappearing before dawn. For now, the Icebox murders remain one of Houston's most infamous unsolved cases, a dark chapter in the city's history that continues to fascinate and horrify people almost 60 years later. And Charles Rogers remains a ghost, a person who stepped out of a normal life and into a legend, leaving behind only questions, theories, and a refrigerator full of nightmares.